All right, friends, credit where it's due. CNN, of all places, delivered an unexpected and unrelenting segment fact-checking a Republican senator's lies, briefly demonstrating what peak political journalism should look like in this country. It's awesome, and I want to bring it to your attention because we should encourage them to continue in this trend. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, folks, I've got two clips to play. One is about 3 minutes long. The other is about a minute and a half, and both concern Kaitlan Collins, who is one of the major star reporters at CNN. And she's been a bit of a mixed bag, as most mainstream journalists are, because CNN, as you know, it's been widely reported, has drifted to the right in terms of its coverage. They're giving CNN town halls to Republican officials left, right, and center. Some of them, I think, try their best to fact check them in real time, but they fail to do so because it's easier for prolific liars to lie, which Republican elected officials are and do, than it is to fact check them. And yet they go full steam ahead anyway. So that's a problem. And Kaitlan Collins was the moderator for the Trump town hall, the disastrous Trump town hall back in May. But in these two segments, she's really redeemed herself. It's really awesome. And so I want to play them. And in this particular one, she sets up everything, right? So I don't have to do much by way of giving you background, except to say, because it's cut off at the very beginning, she is referring to Republican Senator of Wisconsin, Ron Johnson.
May not have read the books that he told us to check very closely. He was here on the show Monday night, and when he was asked a pretty simple question, should someone who tried to overturn the last election be involved in overseeing the next one, the Wisconsin Republican said this. Which
Democrats
one?
have done the same thing.
In Wisconsin,
never tried to
there's been
criminalize
fake slates of electors?
No, it's happened in different states. I didn't come prepared to give you the exact states, but it's happened repeatedly. It has happened repeatedly. Just go check the books.
Which books?
I mean, there have been alternate slates of electors by Democrat electors in our history. Again, this wasn't what this interview was going to be about. I'll come and I'll provide you the information.
I look forward to your office sending that information. We'll publish it if it's accurate. So he followed up on Twitter, listed the 4 examples that you see here, none of which proved his point. Democrats have not repeatedly used alternate slates of electors. None even come close to what Republicans did in 2020. Really, just one of the examples he cites even is relevant to this. There's some big differences, so I'll tell you what they are. The senator is pointing to the 1960 election, something that we have seen Republicans bring up repeatedly since Trump lost in 2020. That year, Democrats in Hawaii sent an alternative slate of electors to Congress. Vice President Richard Nixon at the time and John F. Kennedy, they were nearly tied in the state. But here, the facts about what happened next are critical. At the time, a recount was still underway, one that ultimately flipped the results from Nixon to Kennedy. A judge would rule that the Kennedy electors were legitimate. And I should note that when Kennedy was ultimately the winner in the final count in Hawaii, it was Nixon himself, as vice president, who presided over the session approving that slate of electors instead of his own on January 6, 1961. In 2020, meanwhile, the recount in Wisconsin was over. It showed that Biden did indeed win Senator Ron Johnson's home state. Wisconsin's alternate GOP electors met more than 2 weeks after that recount and still signed a false certificate of electors. Trump and his supporters, of course, would go on to lose 7 more lawsuits in Wisconsin related to the electors. The other examples on Senator Johnson's list are instances where Democrats voiced objection to the election results. Not exactly instances of plots to overturn an election that was affirmed by recounts and by the courts. But even if you disagree with what those Democrats did, most importantly here, those instances went nowhere because the candidates who lost those elections conceded them. Of course, Senator Ron Johnson's role in this has also come under scrutiny, given the text messages showing that his chief of staff was trying to deliver a, quote, alternate slates of electors for Michigan and Wisconsin directly to Vice President Pence on January 6th, something that will surely be included in the history books.
That was awesome. That was awesome. That was peak political journalism. Here's the thing. Sometimes, and I get this in the comments, they say, thank you for the reporting, Josiah. I'm not a reporter. This is not the news. I do not consider myself a reporter. I'm not a journalist. I'm a political commentator. I went to college, got a political science degree. I'm a politics geek. I'm a commentator. I am a pundit, right? I am somebody who gives his opinions and interpretations, and I'm not bias free. I don't pretend to be objective in the sense that, I have no opinion. I have my biases. I have my interpretation, and I'm giving you my opinion. Okay. Journalists like Kaitlan Collins, I think they try to operate under a different paradigm. They try to extract as much opinion out of it as possible. But in so doing, they very often overcorrect. We've talked about this. The mainstream media, CNN, the New York Times, the Associated Press, Reuters, they engage in false equivalences and both sidesism all the time so as to avoid appearing biased. And we've given a gazillion examples, okay, just in the realm of politics. But to take it out of the realm of politics, to give you an easy example, let's say a CNN journalist is interviewing a climate change skeptic, somebody who doesn't believe climate change is real, versus somebody who acknowledges climate change is real. Very often, mainstream journalists pretend that these two opinions are equally valid. They're not. Sometimes in the real world, even though there are a lot of complexities in the real world, facts favor one side clearly over the other. And it's irresponsible and dishonest and irrational and dangerous to pretend that two unequally yoked sides are equally balanced, to create this manufactured artificial balance where none exist. CNN is terrible about this, generally speaking. What Kaitlan Collins did here was tell you the truth. She said, listen, this is what Trump's team did. This is what the Republicans did, trying to basically defraud the United States by sending fake alternate electors deliberately to try to get then Vice President Mike Pence to swing the election for Trump. And then when when Senator Johnson says, no, Democrats did it too. Well, they didn't, right? And she points it out. These things are wildly different in terms of the time involved, in terms of the relevant facts. They're not the same. They're not even comparable. And then she goes on to point out what Ron Johnson's role was in Trump's attempts to overturn the 2020 election and the potential fraud and dishonesty with which he engaged. And right now, fake electors across the country are being prosecuted, and rightly so. But I love the language she used. She didn't mince her words. She didn't insult him, but she's like, listen, there is no symmetry here. What Republicans did was infinitely worse and less defensible, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. That's responsible journalism. When the facts very clearly favor one side over the other, it is dishonest, irrational, dangerous, and I would argue an abdication of journalistic ethics to pretend otherwise so as to avoid not appearing biased. Will Fox News, if they do cover this, tar and feather Kaitlan Collins as some sort of liberal Democratic shill? Sure, but that's inevitable, right? You can't let fear of false accusations drive you to overcorrect in the worst possible way. What she did here was really, really good, and I hope they continue in this respect. Now, she also recently interviewed Tim Burchett, who is a Republican congressman. This was in the aftermath of the vote to impeach to formalize the impeachment inquiry into President Biden. And once again, a Republican embarrasses themselves in front of Kaitlan Collins.
When we hear the complaints about influence peddling, I covered the Trump White House. I didn't hear a lot of complaints from Republicans then about his children and what they were making from their father being president. But when it comes to President Biden himself, what are the specific crimes that Republicans are investigating Joe Biden for?
Well, I'm glad you brought up his children because, as you well know, they were subpoenaed and showed up multiple times in the SCIF in a private deposition, and public, which Hunter decided not to do. He said his last thing he said in his so-called interview out that Schwab arranged for him, that he said, and I will answer all your questions. And then he did just like his father did. He turned around and walked off and got into his taxpayer subsidized Suburban and drove off.
That statement that he came out and gave yesterday, but his offer is to testify publicly. His argument is that if he does it behind closed doors, the Republicans will twist his words or whatever he says. I understand you don't like the prospect. You want him to come behind closed doors, but why not just have him testify publicly? Why not take him up on that offer if you have the questions that you say you have?
I don't have a problem with it, but you know as well as I do, it'll just be time to showboat. And that's what they did during the Trump impeachment. They did it behind doors, and then the Democrats.
So here's the thing. She was right to fact check him both times. She's like, listen, you want to talk about nepotism and influence peddling? No Republican said a word when Donald Trump's kids did the very same thing, actually much worse because they were actually in positions of power. Ivanka and Jared were members of the White House, meaning that they deserve infinitely more scrutiny and should be held to an infinitely higher standard than a private citizen like Hunter Biden. So double standard number one, she was correct to point that out. And then with respect to, Burchett's complaints about Hunter Biden not testifying, well, you all offered, Republicans offered repeatedly. We have the words, we have the transcripts, we have footage of James Comer and others saying, come before us. It doesn't matter if it's in private, if that makes you more comfortable. If you want to do it in public, you can come out before a congressional hearing. So they did make the offer. And Hunter's like, okay, well, if you're going to make me answer questions, I really don't want to, but if you're going to make me do it, then fine. Let's do it in public. That way you can't twist my words and conceal the transcript and conceal the footage, which Republicans have done, as we've talked about. Of the 16 closed-door interviews, they've only released, footage or transcripts for 2 out of 16. And we know that the impeachment resolution, which Tim Burchett voted for to pass, the impeachment inquiry resolution, does not require Republicans to hold one single public hearing or to release any of the footage or even a final report. So she's right to point all these things out, to point out the hypocrisy in real time. Good on Kaitlan Collins. This is a step in the right direction. This is what peak political journalism does look like, following the facts, even if the facts uncomfortably lead to the conclusion that one side is much more hypocritical and morally inferior than the other, which in this case, that would be the Republican Party. So great stuff from CNN. Let me know what you think in the comments.